You have been taught to picture the Victorian era through sepia-toned photographs, through mahogany furniture and lace curtains, through the rustle of silk and the glow of gas lamps behind frosted glass. You have been shown the drawing rooms, the gardens, the afternoon tea services laid out on bone china. You have been told this was an age of moral clarity, of empire, of progress marching forward beneath the soot-blackened sky. But what if I told you that beneath this carefully maintained illusion, there existed entire streets, entire districts, where women lived and worked in conditions so degrading, so meticulously organized, that the era's moral proclamations become almost unbearable to read? That the same society which spoke endlessly of virtue and feminine purity had constructed an industrial-scale system of sexual exploitation, hidden behind heavy curtains and locked doors, operating with the efficiency of a factory and the silence of a grave? This is not a story about scandal. This is not about titillation or Victorian hypocrisy as an abstract concept. This is about cold rooms and unpaid debts, about women whose names were never recorded, about the smell of carbolic soap and coal dust, about staircases climbed dozens of times each night, about the weight of fabric that could never quite keep out the draft, about systems designed to trap, and bodies that broke slowly, and lives that history chose, with remarkable consistency, to forget. What I'm about to show you exists in parliamentary reports, in medical records, in the testimonies that reformers managed to collect before witnesses disappeared back into silence. It exists in the architecture of buildings that still stand today, their purpose written into floor plans that tourists walk past without seeing. It exists in coded advertisements, in police records that document everything except the suffering, in the careful language that Victorians used when they could not bring themselves to name what they knew was happening. Because once you understand how these women truly lived, how the system actually worked, who designed it, who profited from it, and how thoroughly their humanity was erased, you cannot unsee it, and you should not look away. Before we descend further into this world, I need you to understand something. What follows is not the complete story. There are details in the records, specific mechanisms of control, particular methods of entrapment, that only become clear once you see the broader pattern. If you leave now, you'll miss the moment when all of this clicks into terrible focus, when you'll finally understand why this system was so effective and why it remained invisible for so long. Stay through to the end. Some truths can only be understood in full. When Victorians spoke of the social evil, and they spoke of it constantly in newspapers and sermons and parliamentary debates, they described it as if it were a natural phenomenon, a fog that rose from certain streets, a moral contagion carried by individual women who had, through weakness or wickedness, fallen from grace. The language was biblical. The tone was sorrowful. The implication was always the same. These women had chosen their path, and society, despite its Christian charity, could do little except contain the damage and hope for their redemption. This story was told in mahogany-paneled rooms by men who had never set foot in the districts they discussed. It was repeated in drawing rooms over tea, always in lowered voices, always with the assurance that respectable people need not concern themselves with the details. The fallen woman was a concept, a cautionary tale, a character in a moral lesson, not a person who woke each morning in a specific room, in a specific house, under specific conditions that had been carefully arranged by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The mythology was beautiful in its simplicity. The reality was something else entirely. In the popular imagination, shaped by sensational novels and moral reform pamphlets, these establishments were places of velvet and champagne, of women in silk who had chosen a life of ease over honest labor. Even those who condemned them seemed to believe that sin, at least, came with comfort. that the wages of transgression included soft beds and warm rooms and freedom from the drudgery that defined working-class life. This image was not accidental. It served a purpose. It allowed society to maintain two contradictory beliefs simultaneously: that these women were moral failures deserving of condemnation, and that their situation was somehow less desperate than the poverty that surrounded them. It transformed a system of organized exploitation into a story about individual moral choices. It made the invisible architecture of control disappear behind a fog of judgment and assumption. But if you had walked down certain streets in Whitechapel, in Southwark, in the Dockland districts where the real work happened, not the high-class houses that catered to aristocrats, but the establishments where working men spent their wages, you would have encountered something that looked nothing like the mythology. You would have smelled tallow candles and coal smoke and unwashed bodies and the sharp tang of gin meant to mask cheaper spirits. You would have heard the creak of stairs, worn hollow by endless traffic, the slam of doors, the sound of coughing that never quite stopped, the voices negotiating prices in the narrow hallways. You would have seen women standing in doorways in all weather, their faces painted with cheap cosmetics that cracked in the cold, wearing dresses that looked fine from a distance, but were mended and remended, the fabric thin from washing, the hems dark with street mud. You would have noticed how young some of them were, how old others looked, though they might have been barely 30, how their eyes tracked potential clients with the practiced efficiency of market vendors assessing customers. Because that's what this was, a market, operating according to the same economic principles as any other Victorian industry. And if you had looked closely, if you had been able to see past the lurid mythology and the moral panic and the carefully maintained ignorance, you would have noticed something else. The same women standing in the same doorways, night after night. The absence of choice in their movements, the way they glanced back toward the house as if checking for supervision. The fact that despite the money changing hands, they themselves always seemed to be in debt, always 1 week away from disaster, always trapped in a present tense that stretched endlessly forward with no possibility of escape. But this was not what society chose to see. Society saw sin and wickedness and women who had fallen. Society did not see the system, did not see the mechanism, did not ask who owned the buildings, who collected the rents, who profited from the endless cycle of debt and disease and desperate poverty that kept the whole enterprise running. In reality, what existed behind those doors was not a realm of dark luxury, but a carefully calibrated machine for extracting labor from bodies and converting human suffering into profit. And this illusion was carefully maintained, for a reason that will soon become clear. The house was always cold, not the pleasant chill of a winter morning or the dramatic cold of poverty in novels, but a damp, penetrating cold that lived in the walls themselves, the kind that made joints ache and lungs rattle and skin feel perpetually clammy to the touch. Victorian houses were not built for comfort, even expensive ones. But these establishments, the common brothels that served working men, not the high-class accommodation houses that served gentlemen, were converted buildings, old structures subdivided and re-subdivided to maximize the number of rooms, each one barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. The walls were thin, paper-thin in places, or rather, layers of wallpaper over plaster over brick. The wallpaper peeling in the corners where damp crept in. You could hear everything. Footsteps above, voices through the wall, the endless creak of bed frames. The sound became like weather after a while, something you stopped consciously hearing, but that never left you alone. Privacy was a concept that belonged to another world. Here, every transaction was audible to the women waiting in the next room, the woman downstairs collecting money at the door, the servant girl bringing up coal or water or gin. Most of the women did not own the clothes they wore. This detail matters more than it might seem. The dresses, the gaudy, low-cut gowns that signaled their profession, belonged to the house, which meant they could be taken away, which meant that leaving, even if you somehow scraped together enough money to pay your debts, meant leaving with nothing but the shift on your back. The house provided everything: clothing, room, food, coal for the fire, and the house charged for everything. The dress you wore tonight would appear on your account tomorrow. The gin that numbed the evening would be added to your debt. The coal that barely warmed your room, the candles, the soap, the rent for the bed itself, charged by the week, always more than a working woman could earn in any honest trade. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A woman might charge sixpence or a shilling per client, depending on the neighborhood and the desperation of her circumstances. From this, the house took half or more. From what remained, she paid for her room, her food, her clothing, her fuel. The house also charged fees for protection, the word used when the deputy or the maid or the house bully made sure women didn't leave without settling their accounts. In practice, this meant that most women, most nights, earned barely enough to cover their immediate debts, let alone save anything toward escape. And if you became sick, which you would inevitably, because disease was not a possibility, but a certainty in this life, you still owed rent. The room still needed to be paid for. The house did not offer sick days or rest. If you could not work, you went deeper into debt. If you tried to leave without paying, they would follow you. The Victorian underworld had its own systems of enforcement, its own networks of information. A woman who ran from one house would find herself unwelcome at others. A woman who tried to return to honest work would find that her previous employment made her unemployable. The respectable world did not take back its outcasts. The day began in afternoon, when the sun was already sinking toward winter darkness. You woke cold, in a room that smelled of bodies and smoke, and the lingering sweetness of whatever cheap perfume the house provided. Your first action was always the same. Assessment. How much did you owe today? How many clients would you need to cover rent, food, coal, the dress, the stockings that tore last night and would need replacing? The arithmetic was constant, running in the background of every interaction, every negotiation, every moment of the long evening ahead. There was breakfast of sorts, bread and tea in a common room where women sat in silence or spoke in low voices about nothing important. The food was never enough. Hunger was constant, but eating too much meant less money for other necessities, meant going deeper into debt. Some women survived on gin and bread alone, the alcohol providing warmth and numbness and the illusion of fullness. The long-term effects of this diet were visible in the faces of older women, teeth gone, skin sallow, the tremor in hands that came from malnutrition and constant drinking. By early evening, you were expected to be ready, hair arranged, face painted, wearing the house dress that marked you as available. In winter, this meant standing in doorways or windows in clothing that provided no warmth, smiling at men who passed, calling out in voices that were meant to sound inviting. In summer, the heat made the small rooms unbearable, the smell of bodies overwhelming. But at least you were not freezing. The cold was worse. The cold made everything worse. The men came in waves, depending on when the factories closed, when the pubs emptied, when the ships came in. Working men mostly, who had a few coins in their pockets and a few minutes to spare. The transactions were brief, mechanical. The words you spoke were always the same. The movements practiced and efficient because time was money and you needed to see as many clients as possible to have any hope of breaking even. There was no romance here, no seduction, nothing of the elaborate theatrical performance that might happen in a high-class house where gentlemen paid for the illusion of desire. This was industrial, repetitive. Your body was a tool, your room a workshop, and you were paid piece rate for labor performed. Between clients, you washed. Cold water from a pitcher, a rough cloth, carbolic soap that burned and dried the skin, but was necessary because disease was always present, always waiting. The Victorians understood germ theory by the 1860s, at least in its basics, but understanding and having the resources to protect yourself were different things. The soap helped. It didn't help enough. Syphilis, gonorrhea, pregnancy, these were not risks, but inevitabilities. Questions of when rather than if. And underneath all of this, running through every moment like a cold current, was exhaustion. Not the tiredness that comes from a hard day's work and is cured by a night's sleep, but the bone-deep exhaustion of a body that is never allowed to fully rest, never given time to heal, never fed quite enough or kept quite warm enough. The exhaustion that accumulates over weeks and months until it becomes the baseline state of existence, until you can barely remember what it felt like to wake up refreshed. But here is what you must understand. This exhaustion was not an accident. It was not simply the unfortunate result of poverty or circumstance. It was part of the system's design. An exhausted woman does not run, does not plan, does not have the energy to imagine a different life. Exhaustion is its own form of imprisonment, more effective than any locked door. You think this was the worst part? It wasn't. But this suffering was only the surface layer. The average Victorian brothel worker saw between 5 and 15 clients per night, depending on the neighborhood, the season, and her own desperation. Let me make this concrete. 15 transactions meant 15 trips up and down the narrow stairs. 15 negotiations, 15 mechanical couplings, 15 washings with cold water in between. If each encounter lasted 10 minutes, and many lasted less, that was 2.5 hours of direct labor, compressed into the busiest hours of the evening. But the labor was not only the sexual act itself, it was the performance of availability. The hours standing in the doorway beforehand, the smile that never wavered, the voice that called out to potential clients, the constant assessment, can I get sixpence from this one? Is he drunk enough to pay more? Is he violent? The violence was constant. Not every man, not every night, but frequent enough that it became part of the expected texture of the work. A slap because she asked for payment up front. A punch because she suggested using a preventative sheath. Bruises that bloomed purple across ribs and arms and faces. Black eyes explained away with lies to the deputy, who didn't care anyway as long as you could still work. The law offered no protection. A prostitute could not bring charges of assault or rape. The law did not recognize such crimes against women who sold sex. You were legally categorized as already violated, permanently consenting, your body a public commodity that had forfeited the right to refuse. Some houses employed a maid or a deputy, whose unofficial role was to listen for sounds of serious violence and intervene before a client killed someone, because a dead woman meant lost revenue and attracted the attention of police. But intervention meant breaking up the fight, not punishing the man. He would be ushered out, told not to come back, a prohibition that lasted until the next night when someone forgot his face. You would be told to be more careful, as if careful negotiation could prevent the violence of men who came here, specifically, because they could do things they couldn't do elsewhere. The disease took everyone eventually. Syphilis was so common it was simply called the bad disease, with the assumption that everyone would contract it eventually. The first stage was almost mild, a sore that healed on its own, easy to ignore. The second stage brought rashes, fever, aching joints. Many women worked through this stage because they had no choice. The third stage, which could arrive years later, brought madness, blindness, paralysis, death. By then, most women were no longer working anyway. By then, they had aged out or become too sick or had simply disappeared from the records, as if they had never existed at all. Gonorrhea was everywhere, its symptoms painful and persistent. It caused fevers and agonizing pain when urinating, and could lead to chronic pelvic pain, infertility, and death if untreated. There was no effective treatment in this era. Mercury was used sometimes, but it caused its own devastating symptoms: tremors, tooth loss, kidney failure. The cure was often worse than the disease, and neither one would save you. Pregnancy was perhaps the worst fate. A pregnant woman could not work, but still owed rent. The house had no use for her. Some women tried to induce miscarriages using herbs, gin, or crude instruments. Many of these attempts resulted in hemorrhage or infection. Many women died this way, bleeding out in cheap rooms, while other women worked in the rooms beside them. Those who carried to term gave birth in workhouse infirmaries if they were lucky, in their tiny rented rooms if they were not. The infant mortality rate for children born to prostitutes was staggering. Most died within their first year from malnutrition, neglect, or the diseases inherited from their mothers. The few children who survived were sent away to foundling hospitals or baby farms, where they were more likely to die than thrive. A woman could not work while caring for an infant, and houses did not tolerate the presence of children. Motherhood and prostitution were incompatible, and the system had no room for sentiment. You gave the baby away, or you watched it die, and then you went back to work because the debt continued to accumulate regardless of grief. There was no rest. This cannot be overstated. Sunday was not a day off. Christian reformers sometimes insisted that brothels should close on the Sabbath, but enforcement was inconsistent, and many houses simply operated with curtains drawn. The idea of a holiday, of sick leave, of any pause in the relentless cycle of labor and debt, these belonged to a different world entirely. You worked when sick. You worked while menstruating, using rags that had to be washed and reused. You worked while injured, while infected, while so exhausted that your hands shook. You worked because stopping meant falling deeper into debt, and debt was the mechanism that kept the entire system functioning. The rooms were cleaned by the women themselves, if they were cleaned at all. The bedsheets were changed when they became too soiled to ignore, washed in cold water and hung in the back room to dry, still damp when they were needed again. The smell of bodies, of sex, of sweat and smoke, and tallow candles and chamber pots that weren't emptied often enough became part of the architecture, worked into the walls, impossible to remove. Modern people cannot quite imagine how Victorian London smelled. The coal smoke alone was overwhelming, a constant presence that blackened buildings and lungs alike. But inside these houses, the smell was worse, a concentrated essence of poverty and desperation and bodily functions that no amount of perfume could mask. The emotional toll was perhaps less visible, but no less devastating. The psychological cost of treating your own body as a commodity, of performing desire while feeling nothing, of smiling at men you found repulsive, of accepting intimate violation as simply the nature of work. Some women drank to numb this. Some withdrew into silence, becoming blank-faced and mechanical, present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. Some went mad. The workhouse asylum records are full of former prostitutes whose minds had broken under the weight of what they'd endured. And here's a detail that was never meant to be seen. The houses kept records. Not detailed accounts like a respectable business might, but ledgers tracking debts, room assignments, which women had been sick and for how long. These records reveal the system's true nature. They show women trapped for years, their debts never decreasing despite constant work. They show names crossed out with no explanation, deaths that were never formally recorded, disappearances that generated no investigation. They show that the house owners knew exactly what they were doing. This was not exploitation that happened accidentally. This was a designed system, refined over decades, optimized for profit. The life expectancy of a common prostitute in Victorian London was estimated at 4 to 5 years from entering the trade. Not 4 to 5 years total. Many of these women were barely 20 when they started, but 4 to 5 years of active work before death, disease, or complete physical breakdown made them unemployable. By 30, most were either dead or no longer recognizable as the young women they had been. Their bodies broke down in predictable ways: spinal problems from the repetitive labor, pelvic disorders, respiratory illnesses from the damp and cold, alcoholism, the terminal stages of syphilis. Their faces aged rapidly, teeth falling out from malnutrition and mercury treatments, skin taking on the gray pallor of chronic illness. And when they could no longer work, when they had become too sick or too broken, the house turned them out. There was no pension, no retirement, no concern for their fate. They ended up in workhouses if they were fortunate, in the streets if they were not, dying in charity hospitals or anonymous lodging houses or alleyways where their bodies would be found by police who recorded the death with a single line in a notebook. Deceased, female. Occupation, unknown. Yet this was only the beginning of what I need to show you. And once this system was in motion, there was no escape. Now, we must examine the mechanism itself. Not the suffering, you've seen that now, but the architecture of control that made the suffering possible. Because this was not chaos. This was not simply poverty creating desperate circumstances. This was organized, systematic, and protected by law, social custom, and willful ignorance. The houses themselves were owned by landlords who existed in public records only as distant names. The actual operations were managed by deputies, often women themselves, former prostitutes who had survived long enough to move into management. They collected rents, maintained order, recruited new workers, and ensured that debts kept everyone trapped. This system created a buffer between the profiting owner and the actual exploitation. A gentleman could own a building and collect substantial rents while claiming ignorance of how his property was used. Many did exactly this. The recruitment methods varied, but they followed predictable patterns. Some women entered the trade from desperate poverty. They had lost respectable employment through pregnancy or false accusations, or their families could no longer support them, or they had fled from domestic violence into homelessness. These women often came to brothels of their own accord, though choice is a complicated word when the alternative is starvation. But many others were actively recruited. Procurers haunted the railway stations and hiring fairs, looking for young women newly arrived in London, disoriented and friendless. They offered employment as maids or seamstresses. They offered a place to stay. They seemed at first like rescuers. The trap closed in stages. First, the job that didn't exist or paid too little to cover the room and board that was suddenly expensive. Then, the suggestion that there was other work available, easier work that paid better. Then, the revelation that you already owed money for the room, the clothes they'd given you, the food you'd eaten. The debt came first. By the time you understood what was being asked of you, leaving meant abandoning whatever possessions you had and walking into the street with nothing and nowhere to go. For younger girls, and yes, there were girls as young as 12 or 13 in some houses, the methods were even more brutal. They were sold by parents who could not feed them, or by husbands who wanted to be rid of them, or simply taken from the streets by men who knew the police would not investigate the disappearance of a poor child. The age of consent in Britain was 12 until 1875, then raised to 13, finally to 16 in 1885. And even then, enforcement was inconsistent. A young girl in a brothel was not seen as a victim, but as already fallen, already corrupted, already beyond saving. The economics were straightforward and profitable. A busy house with 10 women could generate substantial income. If each woman saw an average of 8 clients per night, and the house took half the fee, that was 40 transactions at 6 pence each, £1 per night, £7 per week, over £300 per year from a single establishment. For comparison, a skilled tradesman might earn £70 per year. The business was lucrative enough that it attracted investment from respectable people who kept their involvement carefully hidden. The police operated under the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s, which were officially about controlling venereal disease in military towns. but in practice created a system of regulated prostitution. Women suspected of prostitution could be forcibly examined by doctors, an invasive, humiliating procedure that confirmed their status, even if they had been wrongly accused. Those found infected could be detained in lock hospitals for months. The acts did nothing to examine or treat the men who were the primary vectors of disease. The system existed to control women's bodies, while leaving male behavior entirely unregulated. But here is what the Contagious Diseases Acts truly reveal. Society knew. The government knew. They knew that prostitution existed on a massive scale. They knew it was linked to poverty and exploitation, and their response was not to address the root causes, but to manage the symptoms in a way that protected male customers while further stigmatizing and controlling the women. The acts were repealed in 1886 after fierce campaigning by women's rights activists. But their existence proves that Victorian morality was never about protecting women. It was about protecting a social order that depended on their exploitation. The house structure itself was designed for control. The best rooms were at the front, visible from the street, where younger and more attractive women worked. These were the showcase, the advertisement. The back rooms, smaller and darker, were for older women, for women with visible disease, for those who would accept the lowest fees. The hierarchy was enforced ruthlessly. Fall down in the rankings and your income dropped, but your debts did not. The system created competition between women, ensuring they remained focused on individual survival rather than collective resistance. Some houses were connected to pubs or gin palaces, creating an integrated business model. A man would drink until his judgment was impaired and his wallet was full, then be directed upstairs where women waited. The alcohol sales and the sex sales reinforced each other, both generating profit for owners who might never be seen. The Victorian era loved vertical integration in its industries, and the sex trade was no exception. The broader economy depended on this system more than respectable society wanted to acknowledge. Prostitution absorbed women who would otherwise be competing for scarce jobs as maids, seamstresses, or factory workers, keeping wages low in those industries. It provided an outlet for male sexuality in an era when marriage was expensive and delayed, when middle-class men might not marry until their 30s. It created an entire supporting economy of clothing makers, landlords, doctors who treated venereal disease, chemists who sold preventatives and abortifacients, baby farmers who took unwanted infants. Hundreds of people made their living from this industry while publicly condemning the women at its center, and the law protected it all through deliberate inaction. Brothel keeping was technically illegal, but enforcement was selective and inconsistent. Police raids happened primarily when neighbors complained about noise or disorder, not because of concern for the women inside. The typical punishment was a small fine paid by the house owner, after which operations resumed immediately. The system of prosecution created paperwork and the appearance of moral enforcement while changing nothing about the underlying reality. The reformers who tried to help often made things worse. Rescue homes existed, but they operated like prisons, with strict religious rules and mandatory labor that was meant to rehabilitate fallen women through suffering and submission. Women who escaped brothels for these institutions found themselves in equally controlling environments. Their pasts held over them as evidence of inherent moral weakness. Many left rescue homes and returned to prostitution because at least there they were not constantly reminded of their shame. The invisibility was systematic. The census recorded prostitutes under vague categories, no occupation, or simply omitted them entirely. Death certificates rarely listed prostitution as a factor, even when the cause of death was directly related to the trade. Medical textbooks discussed venereal disease as if it arose spontaneously rather than being transmitted by men who moved freely between prostitutes and wives. The documentary record is full of gaps and silences, places where Victorian record keepers chose not to see what was directly in front of them. And this brings us to the most disturbing truth. None of this was secret. Journalists wrote about it. Reformers campaigned against it. Parliamentary committees investigated it. The Pall Mall Gazette published exposés. Charles Booth's poverty surveys documented it. Everyone knew. But knowing and acting are different things, and Victorian society chose to contain and manage this exploitation rather than end it, because ending it would have required confronting fundamental inequalities of wealth and power that respectable people benefited from maintaining. The system worked because it distributed guilt so widely that no single person felt responsible. The landlord just owned property. The deputy just managed the house. The clients just satisfied natural urges. The police just enforced existing laws. The reformers just tried to save souls. The doctors just treated disease. The politicians just responded to public opinion. Everyone was complicit, and therefore, no one was culpable. In reality, everyone was culpable. But systems do not suffer. People do. Now we must speak about what it felt like. Not the economics or the structure or the social context, but the texture of consciousness, the experience of being human inside this machine, because the women were human. This should not need to be said, but the Victorian tendency to categorize and condemn made it easy to forget, and modern distance makes it easy to abstract. You woke in darkness or in the gray pre-dawn to cold that had settled into your bones overnight. The first moments of consciousness brought the return of awareness, who you were, where you were, what you would be doing tonight, and every night stretching forward indefinitely. There was no moment of forgetting, no grace period between sleep and the full weight of reality. Your first conscious thought was arithmetic. How much do I owe today? Your body hurt. This was constant. The ache in your back from the mattress that provided no support, the pain between your legs from repeated trauma, the headache from last night's gin, the cough that had settled into your chest and would not leave, the hunger that was never fully satisfied, the cold that no amount of clothing seemed to prevent. Victorian medicine understood pain poorly and treated it with laudanum or alcohol, both of which created their own problems. Many women were addicted to opiates, another debt, another control mechanism, another way the body betrayed you. You existed in a state of constant low-level fear. Fear of violence from clients, fear of pregnancy, fear of disease, fear that tonight you would not earn enough to cover your debts, fear that tomorrow you would be turned out into the street, fear that you were already sick and just didn't know it yet, that the syphilis or gonorrhea was already progressing invisibly toward the moment when it would destroy you. This fear was not panic. You could not afford panic. It was a steady background hum, the emotional equivalent of the cold, always present, never quite ignorable. The worst part was not the physical acts themselves, though those were degrading enough. The worst part was the erasure of your own desire, your own preferences, your own humanity. You learned to split yourself in two, the body that performed the work and the mind that went elsewhere. Disassociation was not a pathology, but a survival skill. You went through the motions while thinking about nothing, or about something else entirely, or about the money you were earning, reducing the interaction to pure transaction so it could be endured. But this splitting came at a cost. You began to feel disconnected from your own body, as if it belonged to someone else, as if you were watching yourself from a distance. Some women described feeling already dead, going through the motions of life without any internal experience of living. The clinical term would be depersonalization, but Victorians just called it being hardened, as if the emotional numbness were a choice rather than a symptom of trauma. The isolation was absolute. You could not speak honestly with clients. They wanted the performance of desire, not your actual thoughts. You could not fully trust the other women in the house because you were competing for the same clients, and one woman's success meant another's failure. You could not go to the police, who saw you as criminal. You could not return to respectable society which had already judged and discarded you. You could not even trust your own perceptions because exhaustion and hunger and fear distorted everything. Letters home, when they existed, were carefully constructed lies. I am employed in service. I am doing well. Please do not worry. The truth could not be written down. The truth would destroy whatever relationships remained, would shame your family, would confirm every terrible thing they might have suspected. So you lied, and the lying created another kind of isolation, another way you were cut off from human connection. There were moments of care between women, brief alliances formed in shared misery. Someone loaning you a shawl on a cold night, someone bringing you tea when you were sick, someone standing outside your door when a client was being violent, ready to call for help. But these connections were fragile, broken whenever someone managed to escape or died, or simply moved to another house. You learned not to become too attached. You learned that everyone was temporary, including yourself. The self-loathing was taught. Society told you that you were fallen, ruined, impure, diseased, morally contaminated. The church told you that you were beyond redemption unless you performed elaborate penances that would leave you broken in different ways. The reformers told you that your only value lay in serving as a cautionary tale. Even the clients, who paid to use your body, treated you with contempt, as if your willingness to survive through prostitution made you less than human. After enough repetition, you began to believe it. The external judgment became internal truth. Some women tried to maintain boundaries to preserve some core of self that remained untouched by the work. They refused to kiss clients. They refused certain acts. They maintained elaborate mental categories between work and self, as if the body and soul could be completely separated. But the boundaries eroded over time. As you became more desperate, as the debts mounted, as your body aged and you had to accept worse clients at lower prices, the boundaries collapsed. Everything became work. Nothing remained private. The repetition was maddening. The same stairs climbed and descended dozens of times each night. The same words spoken, the same negotiations, the same mechanical actions, the same washing afterward, the same preparation for the next client. Time became strange, simultaneously endless and non-existent. Hours could pass in what felt like minutes. Nights could feel like they lasted weeks. You lost track of days, of seasons, of years. Everything blurred into a single continuous present tense of cold and fear and exhaustion. And underneath it all, impossible to ignore or escape, was the knowledge that this would continue until your body broke completely. There was no pension plan, no retirement, no future in which things got better. The best you could hope for was to save enough money to leave, but you never saved enough. The debts ensured that. The system ensured that. So you existed in a permanent present, unable to imagine a future, unable to return to the past, trapped in the repetitive now of survival. The psychological term for this is learned helplessness, the state that develops when someone is repeatedly subjected to circumstances they cannot control or escape. They stop trying. They accept their situation as unchangeable. They become passive, depressed, unable to recognize or seize opportunities even when they appear. This was not laziness or weakness. This was what systematic oppression did to human consciousness. At night, alone in your cold room, after the work was done, you might lie awake and remember who you had been before. A girl with a name and a family and hopes for the future. A person who had laughed freely and made plans and believed that life could be good. That person felt impossibly distant now, almost fictional, someone you had once pretended to be in a different life. The distance between who you were and who you had become was so vast that it felt like death, like you were already a ghost haunting the ruins of your former self. Some women kept small objects from their previous lives, a letter, a ribbon, a cheap piece of jewelry. These tokens were dangerous to maintain. They could be stolen or sold when debts became desperate, but they served as proof that you had once been someone else, that you had once mattered to people who were not paying for your time, that your life had contained something other than this. Prayer offered no comfort. If you had been raised religious, and most Victorian women were, you knew exactly what the church said about women like you. Fallen, impure, Magdalens, who might be redeemed through suffering but would never again be truly clean. The God you had been taught to worship was a God of judgment, and you were already condemned. Some women lost their faith entirely. Others maintained a desperate secret belief that God might understand what society did not, that you had not chosen this, that you were surviving the only way you could, that surely there was forgiveness somewhere for those who had no other options. But even that hope was poisoned by guilt, because survival required things that seemed unforgivable. You had smiled at men you despised. You had performed pleasure you did not feel. You had participated in your own exploitation because the alternative was death. And society said this made you complicit, made you guilty, made you deserving of your fate. The cruelty was exquisite. You were blamed for surviving the system that trapped you. The aging happened quickly. By 25, you might look 35. By 30, you looked ancient. The combination of malnutrition, disease, alcohol, and relentless labor destroyed bodies with shocking efficiency. Your teeth fell out. Your skin developed the grayish pallor of chronic illness. Your hair thinned. Your hands trembled. You walked with a stoop from the spinal problems that were endemic to the profession. You coughed constantly, and as you aged, your value decreased, your prices dropped, your desperation increased, and the cycle accelerated. You watched younger women arrive, 14, 15, 16 years old, fresh and terrified, and you remembered being that young yourself, though it seemed like a lifetime ago. You watched them learn what you had learned, how to dissociate, how to numb yourself, how to calculate debts, how to assess danger, how to survive. And you knew that in 5 years, if they survived that long, they would be where you were now. The system consumed youth and beauty and health and hope, and there was always a fresh supply because poverty was endless. The ones who died were almost enviable. A sudden fever, a hemorrhage, an accident, death came quickly to some, and they were released. You would hear that someone in another room had died during the night, and you would feel a complicated mixture of sorrow and relief and envy. Sorrow for a life ended, relief that it was not you, envy because they were free and you were still here, still trapped, still climbing the same stairs night after night into a future that offered nothing but more of the same. And perhaps worst of all was the knowledge that you would not be remembered. Your name would not appear in any census or record that future generations would read. Your grave, if you had one, would be unmarked or marked with a false name. Your family, if they still acknowledged you, would not speak of you after you died. You would vanish as completely as if you had never existed, another erased woman in a system that depended on erasure to function. The Victorian era was obsessed with death, with mourning, with elaborate funerals and marble monuments and the preservation of memory. But not for you. For you, there would be silence. The same society that built magnificent cemeteries and wore black crepe for years after a loved one died would not even record your passing. You were already dead to them while still breathing. In the rare moments when you were not working, not sleeping, not drinking to forget, in those small gaps that appeared occasionally in the relentless routine, you might find yourself thinking about freedom, not as a real possibility, but as an abstract concept, a fairy tale. What would it feel like to wake up and not owe anyone anything? To walk down a street without performing availability? To touch your own body and feel that it belonged only to you? These thoughts were dangerous because they made the present unbearable. So you learned to suppress them, to stay focused on the immediate task of survival. Yet this was only the beginning of what I need to tell you about the consequences, and this was called ordinary life. Here is the contradiction that defines everything. While these women lived and died in the conditions I've described, Victorian society was simultaneously conducting passionate debates about feminine purity, publishing etiquette manuals about proper behavior for ladies, building elaborate moral frameworks around women's sacred role as guardians of domestic virtue. The same society, the same city, often quite literally the same streets. In Mayfair, women laced themselves into corsets that restricted breathing and movement, symbols of the leisure and fragility that marked respectable femininity. In Whitechapel, women wore corsets too, but theirs were practical garments that allowed them to work through the night, their visibility and availability, part of the performance their survival required. The garment was the same. The meaning was inverted. One woman's constraint was a sign of protection and status. Another woman's was the uniform of exploitation. The Victorian gentleman who spoke eloquently about protecting women's virtue might spend his evening in a brothel, seeing no contradiction in these behaviors. The two categories of women, the pure and the fallen, were so completely separated in his mind that they might as well have been different species. His wife existed in a realm of drawing rooms and calling cards, her sexuality denied and sanctified. The prostitute existed in a realm of backstreets and transaction, her sexuality the only thing about her that mattered. He owed protection and respect to one. He owed nothing to the other. This division was not merely individual hypocrisy, though there was plenty of that. It was structural, built into law and custom and economic reality. The same property laws that made married women financially dependent on their husbands created the conditions that pushed unmarried women into prostitution. The same moral codes that demanded female chastity made women unemployable if they were suspected of sexual experience. The same economic system that paid women half of what men earned for the same work made honest labor insufficient for survival. Prostitution was not separate from Victorian morality. It was its product, its shadow, its necessary counterpart. The children born from the system carried their mother's stigma. Illegitimate births were marked in parish records with shame that would follow the child for life. Even children born in marriage to former prostitutes inherited their mother's taint. Society had long memories for women's sexual transgressions. The sons of prostitutes, if they survived childhood, might escape into anonymity. The daughters rarely did. They entered domestic service if they were fortunate, found themselves in brothels if they were not, the cycle perpetuating itself across generations. The diseases did not stay contained to the women who contracted them directly. Syphilis passed from prostitute to client to wife to unborn child, creating chains of infection that devastated families across social classes. The Victorian epidemic of syphilis was a direct consequence of unregulated prostitution and the refusal to examine or treat mail carriers. But the blame was placed entirely on prostitutes, who were described as vectors of contamination rather than victims of a system that gave them no power to refuse infected clients or insist on preventative measures. The long-term health consequences for survivors were catastrophic. Women who managed to leave prostitution carried the damage with them. Chronic pelvic pain, infertility, the late stages of syphilis that brought blindness and insanity, respiratory illnesses from years of working in cold and damp, spinal problems, alcoholism, laudanum addiction. The body remembered everything the mind tried to forget. Even if you escaped the system remained inscribed in your flesh. The psychological damage was equally permanent. What modern medicine would recognize as complex trauma, the result of prolonged exposure to inescapable threat, manifested as depression, anxiety, dissociation, inability to trust, difficulty forming relationships, chronic hypervigilance. But Victorians had no framework for understanding trauma as something that happened to you rather than something wrong with you. A woman damaged by prostitution was seen as inherently defective, not as someone who had survived ongoing violence and needed treatment. The few who managed to leave the trade often found themselves unable to function in normal life. The skills they had learned, dissociation, hypervigilance, constant calculation of danger, becoming disabilities in any other context. And here's what makes the historical erasure particularly cruel. The very evidence we might use to understand these women's experiences was systematically destroyed. Letters were burned, records were falsified, graves were left unmarked. When reformers did collect testimonies, they edited them heavily, removing details considered too explicit, shaping the narratives to serve moral lessons rather than preserve truth. What remains in the historical record is fragments, glimpses, evidence that has survived despite active efforts to erase it. The buildings still stand. Walk through Whitechapel, Southwark, the areas around the docks, and you are walking past structures that once housed brothels. The architecture remains: narrow staircases, small rooms, the layout designed for exactly what happened there. But there are no plaques, no historical markers, no acknowledgement of what these buildings were or what occurred within them. History has chosen to forget, and the built environment colludes in that forgetting by offering no witness. The descendants of house owners and landlords who profited from this trade became respectable family lines. Their wealth, built partially on the exploitation I've described, funded education and estates and social position. The descendants of the women, if they exist, do not know their own history. The genealogical record contains gaps and lies, false occupations and missing names. The carefully maintained fiction that these women never existed. The profit was inherited. The shame was erased. The suffering left no trace. Even the reforms that eventually came were compromised. The 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act raised the age of consent and increased penalties for brothel keeping, but it also increased police powers to arrest women on suspicion of prostitution, effectively criminalizing survival strategies without addressing the poverty that made prostitution necessary. Rescue homes proliferated, but they operated as carceral institutions that punished women for their pasts. The Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed, but nothing replaced them. Women were simply left without even the minimal medical care the acts had provided. The First World War brought changes, but not liberation. The war created new opportunities for women's employment, but also new demands for prostitution from soldiers. The Spanish flu pandemic killed many who had survived everything else. The 1918 election gave some women the vote, but not the youngest or poorest, not the women most affected by sexual exploitation. The interwar period brought new poverty and new desperation. The system evolved, but did not end. In the historical memory, the Victorian era is remembered for its innovations: railways and telegraph, great exhibitions, empire building, scientific advancement, literature and art. It is remembered for the expansion of democracy, social reforms, the gradual improvement of working conditions. All of this happened. None of it is false, but it coexisted with the system I've described. The brutality was not incidental to Victorian progress. It was part of the same structure. The same laws that protected property rights made women into property. The same industrial efficiency that built railways optimized the exploitation of human bodies. The same moral certainty that drove reform movements created the categories of pure and fallen that justified infinite cruelty. And here's what you must understand about consequences. They are not simply what happened to those women then. They echo forward. The legal frameworks that criminalized prostitutes rather than addressing exploitation persist in modified forms. The stigma that prevents sex workers from accessing protection or justice continues. The tendency to moralize poverty rather than address its structural causes remains. The ease with which society erases the suffering of marginalized women and the men who profit from that suffering is not a Victorian phenomenon. It is a continuing feature of how power operates. The Victorian brothel system was eventually disrupted, but not by moral awakening or sudden compassion. It changed because economics changed, because housing patterns shifted, because new forms of exploitation became more profitable, because 2 world wars disrupted social structures. The women who suffered within it were not saved. They died, or they aged out, or they found other forms of precarious survival. Their suffering served no redemptive purpose. It taught society no lasting lesson. It simply ended when the conditions that sustained it shifted for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. In the archives, if you know where to look, you can find traces. Testimony from one woman who described her life in such precise detail that the reformer interviewing her had to stop and weep. A police record noting the death of an unnamed woman in a brothel, the cause listed as exhaustion. A medical journal describing the physical symptoms of late-stage syphilis with clinical detachment while mentioning that the patient was a prostitute, as if that explained everything. A census with occupations left blank, the gaps speaking louder than any documentation. These are the closest we come to hearing their voices. And even here, in these fragments, we are not hearing them directly. We are hearing what others chose to preserve, filtered through their assumptions and prejudices and agendas. The women themselves remain silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because no one with power to record and preserve their words was listening. History remembers the chandeliers, not the hands that lit them. So we return to where we began. The sepia-tone photographs, the mahogany furniture, the illusion of an era defined by moral certainty and social order. You have been taught to see the Victorian period through museum displays and costume dramas, through the preserved artifacts of wealth and power. You have been shown what that society chose to preserve about itself, which is to say, you have been shown a carefully curated lie. Behind every grand Victorian building was a network of exploitation. Behind every fortune was suffering that was never formally recorded. Behind every moral proclamation was a system designed to benefit those making the proclamations. The contradiction was not accidental. The brutality was not incidental. The invisibility was not a failure of record-keeping, but an active choice repeated daily by everyone with the power to document, to intervene, to change the conditions they knew existed. The women I've described were not exceptional cases. They were ordinary. They were the predictable output of a system that treated human beings as resources to be extracted and discarded. What happened to them was not tragedy. Tragedy implies something unexpected, something that might have been avoided. This was simply the way the world worked, and everyone with power knew it and allowed it to continue. When we speak now of Victorian values, of returning to that era's moral clarity or social stability, we must ask, whose experience are we actually invoking? The gentleman in his club, comfortable in his hypocrisy? The lady in her drawing room, her security purchased through the degradation of other women? Or the woman climbing the narrow stairs for the 15th time that night, her body breaking, her debts mounting, her erasure already in progress? The architectural historian walks past old buildings and sees history. The women who lived and died in those rooms are not history to him. They have been rendered invisible so completely that he does not think to ask what happened in the small rooms on the upper floors. This is not his fault as an individual. This is how historical memory has been constructed, deliberately and systematically, to preserve only what serves power. But you know now. You have seen past the preserved surface to the mechanism beneath. You understand that the Victorian world was not what its advocates claim it was. You know that its moral order was built on systematic exploitation, that its prosperity depended on suffering, that its elaborate social codes existed to maintain hierarchies of power that destroyed human lives by the thousands. The question is what you do with this knowledge. Because the structures I've described, the use of debt to trap workers, the criminalization of survival strategies, the stigmatization of marginalized people, the refusal to hold powerful exploiters accountable, the erasure of suffering that would be inconvenient to acknowledge. These did not end with the Victorian era. They evolved. They adapted. They continue. When you see poverty treated as a moral failing rather than a structural condition, when you see workers trapped in debt cycles, when you see women blamed for the violence done to them, when you see powerful exploiters protected while their victims are criminalized, when you see history written to exclude inconvenient truths, when you see systems designed to benefit the powerful while crushing the powerless, you are seeing the Victorian system in modified form, still functioning, still destroying lives, still protected by the same mechanisms of willful ignorance and systematic erasure. The past is not safely distant. It is woven into the present in ways we have been taught not to see. The same moral frameworks, the same economic structures, the same tendency to preserve comfortable myths while erasing uncomfortable truths. We tell ourselves we have progressed, that we are more enlightened, that the cruelties of the past could not happen now. But cruelty does not disappear. It adapts. It finds new forms. It continues as long as it remains profitable, and as long as enough people can maintain the illusion that it is not happening. The women in those narrow rooms above the gaslit streets are gone now. Their names are lost. Their graves are unmarked or lost entirely. The buildings that house them have been converted or demolished. The records that might have told their stories more completely were destroyed or were never created in the first place. They have been erased with a thoroughness that is itself a form of violence. But erasure is not the same as non-existence. They lived, they suffered, they endured conditions that should have been intolerable, but were instead normalized, systematized, optimized for profit. They were human beings with thoughts and feelings and hopes and fears, reduced to commodities, worked until they broke, then discarded and forgotten. This happened. It was not ancient history or foreign practice or rare exception. It was ordinary, everyday, unremarkable reality for thousands of women in the city that was the center of the world's largest empire, the heart of industrial progress, the self-proclaimed pinnacle of civilization. And it happened because enough people found it convenient to look away. So when we speak of the Victorian age, when we invoke its values or aesthetics or social order, when we display its artifacts in museums and film its stories on screen, whose life are we truly remembering? Whose suffering are we choosing still to forget?